Hey, so it's the last of the blogs for the content that is coming with the big Shouts of Change update. Apparently, next week on Thursday, February 2nd, going by that little bolded text down there. I have just woken up not too long ago and from a rather unpleasant sleep at that, so I look quite a bit disheveled, but I shall proceed nonetheless. So, Kislev's going to be a curious one because Kislev. Oh, I guess they're going to hit it right here, but they are saying gonna be another short story for Kislev for Ostankia. That's very nice. So don't know if it'll actually contain any new lore. It'll just be a bit of flavor text that would be pretty standard. And that on Wednesday, the day before the patch drops, they'll be dropping the patch notes. If there's anything noteworthy about those patch notes, I'll go ahead and record a video talking about them the day they come out. However, sometimes the patch notes just are really minor things like slightly increase the missile strength for Cygors or something like that. In which case, I won't talk about that. So, guess you'll see then on Wednesday. Okay, so talking about the Kislev 8th edition lore and the IP. And talking about, yes, so inevitably that's always going to be the thing to hit with Kislev is that Kislev did have lore prior to Total War Warhammer making them playable. Hair's really getting in the way, it's getting much too long. They had lore going back to the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition book, Realm of the Ice Queen, I believe it was called. And it had a lot of neat stuff. And the Storm of Chaos gave Kislev a army list you could use on tabletop. It was more so supposed to be used as an expansion list to other army lists. It was only a few units, so it was kind of odd for it to stand on its own. But nonetheless, a lot of that stuff has generally stuck through to Total War Warhammer, but some major aspects of the identity have not. Like the Ungol Gospodar split has not stuck around. Now Kislev is very ethnically united, and the Ungol Gospodar split was a big part of Kislev's lore and its army list. And they also united Kislev's, made a united Reformed Church of Kislev, where before Kislev was supposed to still be very relatively primitive and tribalistic religion. So, mm, I I don't personally like either of those changes. I don't let it really bother me, but I would prefer if the Gospodar and Ungol split had stuck around, and Kislev is having a reformed church instead of the more quote unquote primitive, for a definition of primitive, and tribalistic religion. I thought was more interesting because I thought Kislev was interesting. I thought Kislev was interesting being a society that was a mixture between being very civilized in some parts and similar to the Empire, the Southern Realms, or Bretonia, while in other ways being a lot more, I guess, I don't even want to say savage because, it's a thing that's emphasized even within Warhammer Fantasy lore in the books at several points that you can't really underestimate the intelligence of the Norskins or the Kurgan. But the Kislev kind of was on the threshold. They weren't Chaos worshippers by any means. They're, of course, enemies of Chaos. But they were similar to the Chaos worshipping Northmen in a lot of ways. And I thought that was part of what made Kislev interesting. But there was a little, I don't know, it gave me a little bit of a feeling of trying to Warhammer 40k-ify Kislev, trying to bring in a reformed church that had much clearer elements of like xenophobia and hatred of other religions and hatred of magic and all that, which were not elements of Kislev's lore on the tabletop in prior editions. It felt a little bit more like it was trying to lean into the much more popular, of course, Games Workshop IP of Warhammer 40k, which a core element of Warhammer 40k as a setting is the dictatorial church that rules humanity in that setting and the massive amounts of horrible war crimes they commit on their people, as in large part due to that religion. But I get that things are what they are, so I live with it. Okay, with all that ranting done, let's get on to the actual text. I hope it doesn't say anything that makes everything I just said look stupid. Okay, so Games Workshop took them through various designs, concept, and deep dives. I thought I had heard that Kislev was mostly Crave Assembly's work. Well, I don't know. That probably won't ever come out until someone does an interview. Okay, out with the old, in with the new. Yeah. Ostankia is supposed to be Kislev's only true hag mother. That doesn't feel right. That feels like that's just a explanation for why there is no hag mother lord type. I get that they want to. It's kind of like with the Zongors, where they couldn't explicitly say like, "Look, Games Workshop just won't let us." They had to come up with some lore explanation for it. You try and provide what explanations you can to people to make them be less mad on social media, but I don't know. I think it's a little bit of a losing effort, especially with how popular it can be mad on social media, especially if a YouTuber or a streamer or some such encourages you to be. And referencing again that she does not get the house with chicken legs, she gets the sled, which, yeah, that all this is basically dealing with. No, we are not going to address those complaints, which doesn't really matter to me, especially because I've seen there are a couple of modders that are working on chicken leg house mounts for Ostankia and hag mothers, anyways. The Ungol Gospodar split is gone. They're really just having to address all of these complaints here and pretty well say, like, no, we're not. We're staying the course here. Which, yeah, I get it. Yeah, basically saying explicitly saying this is similar to 8th edition, messing up a lot of, I say that as explicitly negative, which on some level it is. But they compare it to 8th edition, changing up a lot of armies, like the recent editions before, even then. Though that's funny because Games Workshop, a lot of the changes that Games Workshop made to races in the later editions, Crave Assembly undid in their own ways. I actually, last time on the blog for Zinch, I was talking about the Centaurs for Zinch and Marked Beastmen, which was a thing Games Workshop did away with at a certain point. But Crave Assembly brought it back. So it's funny to see them address all these Kislev changes in a way that's basically similar to saying, we're doing to Kislev in certain ways. We're making big changes to Kislev. And the prior things you thought of as part of Kislev's identity, well, they're just not there anymore. Interesting. Okay, so that's all the negativity out of the way. Here we go. So, a new spell lore for the Hag Mothers. Okay, I did see about that in passing. I did not get it on recording. I think they announced that at the same time that they released the Cathay blog. And my eyes just glazed over that big old plate of announcements somehow. So, now I get to see it, definitely. So, the lore of the Hag. So, it's a whole new lore. And a lore attribute focused on both hexing enemy units and overcasting to bless your own. Curious. The overcasting system is an interesting one that I feel like a lot of the spell lores don't make proper use out of in ways that could make it more interesting than what it is. There is only one Hag Mother. That's nonsense, but modders will fix that, so I don't care. Okay, a lot of, again, they're just kind of having to double down on the there are no Hag Mothers thing. And yeah, they're really doubling down on it for several paragraphs, so I'm just going to ignore that. The Druzina. Okay. I think I... The Druzina. What are the Druzina? Nobility. Isn't that Russian for nobility? I could be wrong. I don't know very much Russian at all. Effectively none. Okay, here we go. Lore attribute. The Hag Witches draw from the power of the woodlands, fens, and the oblasts of Kislev. So, holding those who stray into them terminally accountable, incantations and curses take shape to summon forth the spirit magic of the land. blessing Kislevites who fight for it and cursing those who may see it harmed. I've always wondered if there's a similarity between the Hag Witches and the Hag Mothers and the Wood Elves in a way. But I guess the Kislevites are a bit more devoted to, well, what is now called the Motherland, but used to be, oh, what was she called? She was the goddess trapped in the glass box underneath Prague. I forget the proper name she had. She was one of the old gods of law. But whatever. Okay, so the lore attribute is a either curse or blessing. So if you have buffed your troops, then provide spell resist to your troops. If you have used a debuff on enemy troops, then it decreases the leadership of the enemy army. Okay? Okay, so yeah, it's effectively that each of the spells is 2 different spells in one. So she can summon a forest on the spot. That's quite cool. And the curse variant decreases enemy speed, charge speed, and vigor. While the buff variant does the reverse for your units, while also granting Strider and Unspottable. That's quite nice. I like the buff version of that quite a lot. That's cool. I'd like to throw that around, certainly. Witch Brew, we do have a damage spell. I was curious about that. I remember when there was a popular Kislev mod for Warhammer 2, which did a lot of things very differently from Crave Assembly's own version of Kislev. And it added a Lore of the Hags as well. And the Lore of the Hags in that mod was very strange because it was nothing but buff and debuff spells. It had no damage spells. But I figured Crave Assembly wouldn't go without damage spells, at least partly because the damage spells are not only flashier, but generally speaking, there are a lot of people who just never use buff or debuff spells. It's an indirect benefit, you know, whereas damage spells are a direct benefit. People tend to go for immediate gratification. It's sometimes hard to tell whether or not a buff or debuff helped you at all, whereas a direct damage spell, it's pretty clean to see. It killed those people. Okay, so Witch Brew is a breath spell that does damage and applies poison, or it's a breath spell that damages units in its paths in its blessing form still, and applies a contact effect to friendly units, which heals them, boosts their vigor, and makes them immune to enemy contact effects. Wait, is it still going to do the immediate damage to friendly units, but then it applies the positives afterwards? Or is it going to be a thing where it simultaneously damages enemy units and heals friendly units? Curious. I'd like to try that out. I guess I will get to try it out next Thursday. Curse of the Ancient Witch. The hex form of it negatively affects enemy missile block chance, really, armor, and will spread to nearby enemies within the spell spread range, like the Nurgle spells that spread like diseases. Okay, missile block chance. There's not a lot of spells or debuffs that affect that. That's interesting. Okay, so that's going to really benefit a more ranged heavy Kislev army by nullifying enemy shields. The buff version gives magical attack, increases armor-piercing missile damage, base missile damage, and reload skill. Okay, so that's really a spell for ranged armies. Well, every Kislev army that isn't entirely made of melee cavalry or monsters is a ranged army by nature, because Kislev, all of their infantry is simultaneously missile and melee infantry at the same time. But nonetheless, yeah, that's very neat. Vengeance of Spirits, this spell looks cool. It's like, that's some Death Stranding stuff. Okay, so it provides a area of direct damage and applies the Silence attribute, which stops affected units from being able to use abilities or cast spells. Interesting. So you want to make sure that any enemy casters are in the center of it if you can. While the buff version increases the flow of winds of magic and still deals damage. Okay, so you'll still want to cast it on the enemy army, but this time it'll provide a winds of magic buff rather than preventing enemy casters from casting magic. That, I'll be honest, that sounds better, because to me, I'm never, like, when I play single player, I should say. In multiplayer, it's a different thing. You want to deal with the spellcasters, and you want to keep them from spellcasting if you can help it, because they can do a lot of damage. Single player, generally speaking, unless it's a Skaven with the Warp Lightning spell, you don't usually need to be worried about them doing all that deadly spell casting. The AI is pretty terrible at knowing where to place its spells. So in single player, yeah, the buff version is the one you'd want to go for. Multiplayer, though, the nerf version may have some viability. I'm not sure. A vortex spell, naturally, we can't not have one of those. They're the big flashy ones. So the curse version is a static central vortex that fires out projectiles that spawn smaller moving vortexes upon impact. Oh, this is weird. Okay, so we already got the Chaos Dwarf spell that was a magic missile that once it reached its destination, it would then form a little vortex that shot out more tiny magic missiles in every direction. This is a vortex spell that sits in place, shoots out magic missiles that when they impact form tiny vortexes. That's weird. Cool. It's cool to see it though. I like to see these weird spell effects. And the buff version no longer harms friendly units. Okay, vortexes that don't harm friendly units are really, really strong, so that's nice. That's gonna be good for Kislev. This seems like a really, really strong spell lore, excuse me. I skipped over the lord right there. Okay, Malediction of Madness. As a debuff, it negatively affects base weapon damage, armor-piercing weapon damage, melee attack, and inflicts rampage. That's interesting. A spell that provides rampage. How many other spells do that? Not a lot. While the buff version increases the base weapon damage, armor-piercing weapon damage, melee attack, and inflicts rampage. Okay, that's cool. Because if your unit is already in melee, you can throw that spell on them, and it doesn't matter that they're rampaging. They're already in melee. They're not going to go off and do something you don't want. They're just going to stay in the melee they're already in. As a debuff, that is, of course, interesting because you can use it to force enemy units to get into fights they don't want to. Throw that on a unit that's trying to run away, and they won't be running away anymore. Throw that on an enemy spellcaster who are fragile and should be avoiding melee, and watch them dive into melee. Throw it on an enemy missile unit, and they'll stop shooting and just try to dive into the fray. So that would have a lot of uses. That's a cool spell. I assume it's going to have a very high winds of magic cost, though, given that it's listed last and it's got some pretty nasty benefits. Okay, here we go. The Druzino Lord. How is this different from the Boyars? So the Druzina is a character steeped in Kislev lore, a lesser noble that lives beyond the walls of Kislev's great cities and tends to his own lands and his own people. Okay, so the Druzina is basically a little bit... We can't have the Gospodar... We're not having the Gospodar Ungol split, but we're still having the city-country split, which is effectively still just the Gospodar Ungol split. In which case, the Boyar is the Gospodar Lord, the Druzina is the Ungol Lord. But this guy is more Lord of the countryside, and it looks like he's going to be hybrid infantry. A hybrid infantry Lord is actually one I've been waiting on for Kislev. It always stuck out to me that the Boyar was pure melee, while most of his army was going to be hybrid units. But yeah, lesser nobles live beyond the walls of Kislev's great cities and tend to their own lands and their own people. Ever ready to serve the Tsar or Tsarina, the Druzina are well connected to the nature that surrounds them and bring them with them to war. Surrounds them and bring with them to war items that have been handed down generation by generation. They will act as a great addition to Kislev's roster, bridging the gap that we had between the Boyars and that of Mother Ostankya, and who could lead her armies. The Druzina are drawn from minor Kislevite nobility, and consist of land-owning men of sufficient means that they can afford a horse, armor, and weapons with which to defend the motherland when called upon by the Tsar. As is befitting of members of the establishment, Druzina have disdain for city dwellers, and are keen on preserving the rural hierarchy that provides their power and status, but are also self-sufficient, resourceful, and have a healthy attitude to the very real likelihood that they will be killed during military service. The Druzina's main weapon of choice is the Great Axe, very nasty when swung with conviction, yet they also carry a bow. A Great Axe, so they have armor piercing, but they lose out on anti-infantry. Seems like to me you'd want to still go with the Druzina even as a melee lord then, because armor piercing is generally a lot more valuable than anti-infantry. Nonetheless, I like the design. The design is quite nice. Looks like a more wealthy man of the country, certainly. It seems like to me, I always think of how to build themed armies, because I'm a lore nerd, and I like building themed armies in Total War Warhammer. That's a lot of the fun for me. This guy seems like... So Kislev has a little bit of a lore thing where there's a split between the old way of doing things militarily, the old way of doing war for Kislev, which is armies comprised of winged lancers and horse archers, in large part drawing on Kislev's heritage amongst the Kurgan, while the newer way of doing war is largely comprised of Kossars. And I always thought that was an interesting split. And sadly, in Total War, there was generally a tendency not to play armies entirely comprised of cavalry. But this guy would be interesting for playing an old-fashioned Kislev army, largely comprised of the winged lancers and the horse archers. So I appreciate that. That's very cool. Especially if he can ride a horse, and he can skirmish alongside the horse archers or get into melee alongside the winged lancers. The only mount he has is a war horse. Okay, that's cool. I'm glad that there's a lord for Kislev who does not ride a bear. I'm fine with the Boyar and the Ice Witch being able to ride bears. It sticks out that the Patriarch and the Frost Maiden can ride them, though. The Frost Maiden can ride a bear, right? I think she can. So, yeah, despite being a faction of hybrid units, Kislev has lacked a truly hybrid lord-type character sitting between the melee-focused Boyar and the magic-focused Ice Witch. That's entirely what I was thinking. He can support missile lines with his abilities and hold his own in melee. He himself is a hybrid lord. He buffs missile units. And he can replenish ammo. Ammo replenishment I always find to be an odd thing. For the Dwarfs and the Vampire Coast, it makes a lot of sense. The Dwarfs and the Vampire Coast are generally the two races in the game that really want to play the game as slowly and defensively as possible. If they can get away with it, of course. So giving them ammo replenishment makes a lot of sense. It further encourages their slow defensive playstyle. So if you run out of ammo, you can keep doing it. And of course, for the Vampire Coast, it makes extra sense because they deal more damage when they're at high ammo levels rather than mid or low ammo levels. Or ammo levels. I don't know why I said animal levels. Kislev, that's a little bit more odd. Kislev can certainly play a defensive playstyle. But Kislev, to me, what is their core identity is their flexibility. Because of the amount of how much of their army is hybrid units that are equally at home both in melee and shooting, and how much of their army is cavalry, which are flexible by nature. So it sticks out to me as a little bit odd that they get ammo replenishment. But I guess we'll see how it works in gameplay. The legendary hero is the Golden Knight, Nariska Lesa. Okay. Golden Knight is the champion of the Ice Queen. This is an honorary rank bestowed to the greatest warrior amongst the Druzina, or occasionally the Boyars, or even the common soldiery. Nariska is the daughter of the previous Golden Knight, who died at the side of Tsar Boris. As a girl, Nariska learned swordcraft from her father, honing her skills as a warrior from the finest in the realm. Although she was derided by her peers, she stood forward as a candidate as the guardian of the Tsarina when the Druzina elected her father's successor. Nariska is tall and powerfully built, the physical equal of any mighty warrior. But her greatest attribute is her determination. Such is her drive that she trains longer and more intensely than any other, and in battle she fights with a fury born of stubborn pride. In Kislev, she is unmatched in combat. Every Golden Knight is consecrated by the cult of Ursun, and so Nariska bears both religious ornamentation and the favors of the Ice Court. In this way, she unifies the divided church and state, and also provides an explanation for why she can be called upon by both Katarine and Kastaltian despite their issues with each other. The Queen of Kislev's champion is known as the Golden Knight, an honorary rank bestowed upon... Okay, just repeating that. The current incumbent is Nariska Lesa. In spite of fierce opposition from her peers, Nariska was promoted to champion on merit, for she is easily the physical equal of any man, and twice as determined, having learned swordcraft from the finest practitioners in the land. She is a whirlwind of furious attacks, and yada yada. Okay, so here we get to see the concept art. Oh, we're not going to see the actual gameplay. They're not going to see the actual game model. The concept art does look cool, though. Little bit over-designed for my taste, but... I get that Lords and Heroes being a little bit over-designed in terms of armor, I think is fine. It's when the units are over-designed that I take issue with. The big shoulders are a bit much. She's a heavily armed guardian hero, with a focus on protecting friendly characters and buffing the resolve of her comrades nearby. Wearing a full suit of armor and wielding the powerful magical sword Ursun's Claw. She is a bulwark with which many a foe will have difficulty overcoming. She has bodyguard. The more damage she takes, the more she buffs friendly units. And she's a duelist who does well fighting enemy lords and heroes. And she can ride a warhorse, but not a bear. Okay. Cool. That's the legendary hero I think everyone expected, but cool to see her. Now, I'm curious about the remaining units. The Drazina was already a surprise. I assume that it's going to be entirely whole cloth new made up stuff. After all, there's very little left to pull from Kislev's tabletop, and evidently they just don't want to pull from Kislev's tabletop. So I'm curious to see what else there is here. So we have Kislevite Warriors. Not every unit in the DLC needs to be a centerpiece monster. I'm glad to hear that. I was a little bit worried that, especially with the DLCs going higher in price, that they would try to make up for the higher price by making it all be big centerpiece monsters. Kislevite warriors armed with their halberds are tier 1 troops that are decent at withstanding a charge and bound by their blood will fight to the bitter end of Kislev. Take an inspiration from old Mordheim miniatures. That's cool. The grim and hardy appearance of these men of the Obelisk tell tales of a lifetime of endurance. Nothing matters more to Kislevite warriors than the defense of the motherland against the insidious forces of the ruinous powers, and the preservation of a way of life stretching back many centuries. Tasks they undertake with grim determination and armed with razor-sharp halberds. They are deeply religious, cherishing the traditional Kislevite gods, but chiefly Ursun, the bear god, from whom they surely draw their strength in combat. Such men are also extremely loyal to the Tsar and his family, whom they consider to be important symbols of Kislev just as much as the father bear himself. Well, I like this concept art here, definitely. So, okay, they're halberd wielding infantry. A low price point because they don't pay the tax of being a hybrid unit. More entities than standard Kislevite infantry. Cheap, anti-large frontline troops. Okay, now I do have an issue here, though. To me, a big part of Kislev's identity is that they're all hybrid units on the infantry front. Except for the Tsar's Guard, who you don't get access to until the late game. Now, my issue is that, generally speaking, players tend to fall into formulaic ideas of the way an army should work. And I thought with Kislev, I was a little bit worried when they introduced the armored Kossars, but the armored Kossars are hybrid infantry as well. What worries me here is that new players will pick up Kislev and not understand the hybrid infantry focus and use Kossars as missile units and use these guys as their entire infantry formation. And even players who already know how Kislev works but just aren't comfortable with it will still try to play Kislev as a more standard classic Total War army with, like I said, Kossars in the back as expressly missile infantry and nothing else, and the Kislevite warriors making up the front ranks. To me, I prefer for each of the armies in Total War Warhammer to have as much of a unique identity as possible, generally speaking. And I think this goes against Kislev's identity. I'm not really a big fan of this edition. They look neat as, like, low-tier infantry. I think that low-tier infantry is underrated in terms of their significance and how they can look rather cool sometimes. I appreciate that they show a more rural side of Kislev, but I do think this really contrasts with Kislev's identity. So, got a mixed reaction to this. Whereas the Drazina I was pretty fond of. I will say this does stick out in terms of if you want to build an Ungol army, even though Crave Assembly doesn't want you to, build a discount-themed Ungol army, these guys would fit perfectly into that. And the Frostworm. What the actual fuck? Okay, then. So, it's a Norse, okay. So, Norska gets a unit called the Frostworm, which they're saying right there. And it's just a Chaos Dragon with some ice on it. And fair enough. That's what a Chaos Dragon that hangs out in Norska all the time would look like. Makes sense. It's honestly kind of odd that you can't take a Frostworm as a mount when you're playing Norska, but it's okay. Frostworms are creatures of magic who primarily... This is weird. Why do they look like Cathayan dragons? Also, if they are dragons, I'll hit the lore paragraphs in a second. But, like, major thing that Karl Franz is the only living human in the present day of the Warhammer world who can ride a dragon. No other human has ever been able to. Excuse me, not ever been able to. No other human is noted to be able to in the modern Warhammer world. So what's the deal here? Okay, now let me actually hit the lore paragraphs. Frostworms are creatures of magic and primarily roost in the crags of Shargun, swift and sinuous, who sleep away the warmest parts of the year in hibernation, venturing out into the Oblast to hunt prey when the weather is at its coldest. Their natural prey are the wandering herbivorous beasts, which are easily devoured whole by an adult frostworm in times of famine. They have been known to consume chaos beasts, too, taking savage delight in chomping down a troll or minotaur when the need arises. Beings of ice magic, frostworms are naturally aligned to the witches of the Ice Court. In desperation, an ice witch will travel to the crags and beseech the slumbering worms for aid, and it is not unknown for a frostworm to answer their calls in times of coldest winter. The Ice Queen's power is such that a winter travels where she does, and no frostworm could ever refuse her. So I know they've explicitly said several times that they're basically the old Games Workshop Storm of Chaos Kislev army list has not been a priority. They effectively, outside of a couple of units, have largely ignored it. And this really sticks out to me as it bothers me a little bit. So I really should probably been more bothered with the initial Shadows of Change units that came with it. Kislev on the tabletop stuck out to me as an army that did not get any monsters. There's, of course, the War Bears, but that's really more monstrous cavalry. And I was a little bit bothered when they revealed the Elemental Bear. But I decided to live with it because, for one thing, the thing was ludicrously expensive. So you weren't really going to be able to spam them too much unless you're cheesing, which I guess most people do anyways, but that's not the way I do it. So it didn't really mess with the faction identity of Kislev too much for me. The Incarnate Elemental of the Beasts, I guess, didn't really stick out too much for me either, because again, it was rare. I guess this one will also probably be ludicrously expensive and relatively rare. But it sticks out to me making Kislev a monster-focused faction, how that just wasn't what they were prior. I guess on some degree I just need to fix a lot of my expectations. And I mean, this this design here doesn't strike me as anything special. It's just a dragon with ice crystals on it. But I do like this design. There we go. That's cool. When its face is actually made out of ice, when it's utterly made out of ice, that's cool. That's unique. But are these dragons? Are they ice elementals? Because that could be a big difference. Is it suddenly now a thing that Kislev, they just ride loads of dragons? To me, that just contrasts with a lot of Kislev's more groundedness comparative to, let's say, the High Elves, where it's part of the lofty, higher fantasy of the High Elves that they ride dragons frequently. I don't know, it messes with the identity of the faction. Like, if it's an ice elemental, I can definitely deal with it better. But this sticks out to me as really odd. This sticks out to me as just, we wanted to throw in, felt like we needed to throw in another centerpiece to make the fans happy. Which, not really a fan of. Can he fly? Can he just walk around? If he can just, I'm gonna be honest, it's such a silly little thing. But if he can't fly, that would make a big difference to my opinion of this monster. So, does it say that he can fly? It doesn't say they can fly. If it's less really a dragon and more just a big freaky lizard, that would be different. That would be different. Also, why do they have the same name as the Frostworms of Norska? That's because they're not similar at all. Like, clearly these things are relatively capable of being tamed by civilization, or at least by ice magic, while the Frostworms of Norska are just chaos dragons that have slept in the snow for too long. This is very weird. This is mystifying. Okay, okay. Let me get to this end bit here. My webcam is covering up the text, so I'm gonna have to scroll up. or scroll down rather. It's a deadly mid-tier monster. Why is it mid-tier? This thing's huge. Why is it mid-tier? That is not mid-tier. Shut up. If it has mid-tier stats with that big of a hitbox, it's going to get shredded by enemy infantry. They're just going to swarm all around it and do loads of damage to it. If you're going to be that big, you need big stats to match it so you don't just take loads of damage. Okay. Move its way across the battlefield relatively quickly. They tried to make it comparable. Okay. Mid-tier is a Hydra or Stegodon? What? I think of those as high-tier monsters. Okay. Well, I mean, the Stegodon's, like, really expensive. The Hydra's one of the most expensive units in the Dark Elf roster. Okay, it can't fly, I'm going to assume. So, there we go. It seems like it can't fly. And it's supposed to stand out comparative to the Elemental Bear, their incarnate Elemental Beast. I don't know, I don't think it really stands out compared to the Elemental Bear that much, but whatever. It's fast for a creature of its size, has Frostbite, it's a mount for Katarin and the Ice Witches. I like that it's not a mount for the Frostmaidens. That's very cool. Okay, yeah, if it's less dragon and more just creepy ice lizard, then I'm fine with it. I can definitely deal with it. It's weird that they consider the Stegodon and the Hydra mid-tier, but that's, like, doesn't actually matter. I just find that funny that they would call those mid-tier. Those are very expensive monsters that generally can do a lot of damage. When I think of the mid-tier monster, I really am thinking of the Manticore or Griffin, or not Griffin, War Eagle. But I suppose Manticore and War Eagle are both like the cheapest monsters you can get. Some of the cheapest monsters you can get. So I guess they're really the low tier. I just think of them as mid tier because they're more expensive than your standard unit of, you know, spearmen. Yeah, I guess if the high tier of monsters is the crazy stuff like the Elemental Bear, the Rogue Idol of Gork and Mork, the Dread Saurian, the really crazy stuff. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But I would still think of this as effectively a high-tier monster. In my brain. Okay, and free LC, the Ice Court Sled. So, they are finally putting in the Ice Court Sled for, I assume, not just Katarin, but the Ice Witches, given that it says Ice Court rather than Katarins. It's free LC, it's drawn by mighty steeds with breath like the winter wind. And it's gliding on ice crystals. Yes, that all makes sense. I will go ahead and say I don't get too persnickety about the ice sled's existence, but I do prefer for it to not be an ice sled in most of the cases. This is definitely a case where I'm fine with it being an ice sled. And there are a variety of mods that deal with the ice sled issue anyways. But either which way, yeah, this looks cool. This is about what I expected. Very nice. Very Santa Claus, definitely. It's fast. It can plow through enemies. And it comes with an Ice Guard crew. Oh, it's only a mount for Katarin. Really? Okay. Huh. Well, I guess that's neat for her to get a unique mount, but it calls into question. Doesn't she already have 2 mounts? She already has the horse and the bear. I guess she's going to end up with 4 mounts, because she'll have the sled and the frostworm. Okay, that's, a little bit odd, but okay. Okay, and hope you enjoyed learning about all the new characters. Added treat for lore lovers next week. Okay, yeah, that's going to be, I am a lore lover, so I'm curious to see what that'll be. It'll be for Total War account holders, makes sense. And a little picture showing everything that comes with Shadows of Change DLC now if you buy it. Okay, that's cool. Though, hang on, I noticed that iCold's right there. Isn't iCold free DLC? Oh, we do get to see, okay. That's cool. We get to see the gameplay versions of Druzina, Satang, the Golden Knight. That's all very nice. The Zinch Lord on a disc. So yeah, this is a very nice shot. That's really cool. Yeah, this is definitely, I would definitely consider this a success, personally. Yeah, like I said, I had some minor gripes, certainly, about Kislev's 2 units. They added, I can ultimately get over with it. At the end of the day, I'll still play Kislev as a hybrid infantry-focused army, regardless of the fact that they now have a cheap, crappy frontline infantry that they can go with if they want. The Frostworm still sticks out to me as odd for multiple reasons, but I'll definitely get over that. The Cathay and Tzeentch editions both look very cool. I'm happy to see both of those. The Tzeentch Lord and Hero just look great. That's the Exalted Hero of Tzeentch is awesome. He makes me excited to see what the Exalted Hero of like Slaanesh or the Sorcerer of Nurgle are going to look like come those DLCs. Yeah, put together, this shot really highlights that Shadows of Change is going to be a much more worthwhile DLC. And did we actually get to see the Gate Master in gameplay, or did we just see concept art? Well, he's right there in either way. It is funny, though, they put the Zongor, the Yakshina, the Moon, the Croman, there we go. And the Changebringer, the Tzeentch Centaur, or the Zentagor, I'm probably just going to call it the Zentagor. All here is singular characters, so it looks like these are Lord and Hero types. That'd be a little bit funny looking if they were. Boy, with all this put together, the Yakshina really sticks out. I guess the frontline Kislevite farmer dude, Halberdier dude, I guess these two both kind of stick out as oddball units who don't have a whole lot of new assets going on. But the rest of the DLC certainly makes up for it in terms of looking grandiose. So that's all very cool. I think Shadows of Change DLC is definitely now in a much better place. I think what I said at the start of the Cathay blog was that I thought a lot of the issue with the Shadows of Change DLC was that they concentrated a lot of the value of the DLC into the campaign mechanics, and they overestimated just how much people value campaign mechanics. So the fact that you got so relatively few units for a DLC that is that high priced stuck out to people, I think. And I think it really shows they recognize that flaw was a major issue with the way that they are, of course, adding on Shadows of Change and are going to be considerably expanding Throne of Decay and the Slaanesh DLC afterwards in this way. When you look at all this, this is a crazy expansion of content, which makes me very curious for future DLCs, of course. I mean, the new Lord and Hero types, to me, are really exciting, because all of those are massive changes to the whole roster. The units, inevitably, you're going to go without using some of the units on some playthroughs and with some armies. After all, you can only build so many armies. Unless you're a world painter, in which case you're probably going to get around to having that many armies where you're going to use every unit. Unless, of course, you're a cheeser, which if you're a world painter, you're probably also a cheeser. So, in which case, just enjoy yourself building loads of elemental bears, I suppose. But the Lords and Heroes are always big gameplay changes. And I'm very curious to see them in play. Yeah, very cool stuff. Very cool stuff. I'm excited for the update when it comes out next week. And I'm also excited for the update to come out so that I can, just as I was getting ready to start a new Total War playthrough and put it up on the channel, record it and put it up on the channel, was of course when this update was announced. So naturally I had to stop the playthrough because the update's probably going to invalidate past saves. But nonetheless, yeah, very cool stuff. Glad to see it. Excited to see the future. I am curious to see what additions they'll make for the Empire, for the Dwarfs. There's a little bit of contrast there where Kislev gets some things wrong and some things right, whereas Cathay, I think that the Cathay roster has been consistent bangers from the beginning. I don't think that Games Workshop or Crave Assembly, whoever is responsible for a lot of the decision-making regarding Cathay, I don't think they've made a slip-up yet. I think that Cathay is wonderful. So, regarding the new additions to the Empire and Dwarfs, I'm very curious to see which direction it goes. I'm hoping there isn't too much faction identity dilution. I think it's somewhat inevitable that the Dwarfs will start to get monsters, which, on some level, I regard as sad, because to me, the Dwarfs' faction identity at their core is infantry, 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 and a little bit of fast but glass cannon flying units. But it's kind of inevitable that we're going to see some monsters added there. The Thunderbarge is already going to be a big change for their roster. I think it's inevitable we're going to see the Roan Golems and Ruined Guardians too. Empire, I have no idea beyond adding some new knights and probably some new artillery pieces. For all intents and purposes, Empire could probably end up getting a new monster too. That would really mess me up if the Empire and Bretonnia started getting big monsters, because to me that's, again, part of their faction identity is that they don't get access to big, easy monsters like that. Barring maybe arguably the steam tank for the Empire. But nonetheless, this has all generally been very cool news. I'm excited for the update, and I suppose I will see you guys whenever the patch notes drop. Later.